September 18th, 1873. It was the day the music stopped. For a decade, America had been drunk on money. The Civil War was over. The railroads were expanding west, eating up land and capital like a starving beast. Every banker in New York, every investor in London, believed the line on the graph would go up forever. But on this humid Thursday morning, the impossible happened. J. Cook and Company, the bank that had financed the Union Army during the Civil War, the bank considered too big to fail, insolvent. The news hit the floor of the New York Stock Exchange like a physical blow. Stock prices didn't just dip, they evaporated. Men who had walked into the exchange that morning as millionaires walked out owing debts they could not pay in 10 lifetimes. By noon, the police were called to stop the riots. By 3 p.m., the governing committee did something they had never done in history. They closed the stock exchange. "400 miles away, in the soot-choked air of Pittsburgh, a 38-year-old Scotsman named Andrew Carnegie received the news. Most history books paint Carnegie as an old man with a white beard, a philanthropist giving away libraries. But that is not the man of 1873. The Andrew Carnegie of 1873 was a gambler, a hustler. And on this specific day, he was a man standing on the edge of a cliff. He had just made the biggest bet of his life. He had liquidated his safe assets. He had borrowed heavily. He had leveraged everything he owned to build something the world said was impossible. He wasn't building a railroad. He was building a factory to make a new, unproven material called steel. And when the telegraph clicked that J. Cook had fallen, Carnegie realized the terrible truth. The loans would be called in. The cash would dry up. The construction would stop. If he couldn't find cash and find it immediately, he wouldn't just lose his factory. He would lose his reputation. He would be cast back into the poverty he had spent his entire life running away from. This is the story of how Andrew Carnegie stared into the abyss of the Great Depression of 1873 and didn't blink. To understand the panic, you have to understand the player. Before 1873, Andrew Carnegie was what we would call today a deal junkie. He wasn't an industrialist yet. He was a capitalist in the purest sense. He didn't make things, he made money. He had come from nothing. A starving immigrant kid from Scotland who started working at age 13 for $1.20 a week. But he had a superpower, charm. He climbed the ladder of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the most powerful corporation in the world. By his 30s, Carnegie was rich, but he was new money. He had his hands in everything. He owned stock in sleeping cars, oil wells, iron bridges, and telegraph lines. He was diversified, safe. If one industry slowed down, another would pick up. This is the advice every financial advisor gives you today. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. But in the early 1770s, Carnegie saw something that terrified him. Iron. The world was built on iron, but iron was weak. The trains were getting heavier, the engines faster. The iron rails were snapping under the weight. Bridges were collapsing. The infrastructure of America was literally breaking apart. Carnegie knew the solution was steel. Steel was an alloy of iron and carbon, harder, stronger, more durable. The problem was the cost. Making steel was a slow, agonizing process. It was a luxury metal used for cutlery and swords, not railroads. It was simply too expensive to mass produce until Carnegie met Henry Bessemer. In England, Carnegie saw a massive pear-shaped vessel, the Bessemer inverter. It blasted cold air through molten iron to burn off the impurities. It turned a process that took weeks into a process that took minutes. Carnegie stood before the converter, watching the flames roar into the sky, and he saw the future. He didn't just see a metal, he saw a monopoly. He rushed back to America and declared he was going to build the largest steel plant in the world. He picked a site at Braddock, Pennsylvania, right where two railroads and a river met. His partners thought he was crazy. They told him steel was unproven. They told him the technology was finicky. They told him the economy was looking shaky. Carnegie didn't listen.
And this is where he made the fatal move. To fund this massive plant, which he named the Edgar Thomson Works, after his old boss to flatter him, Carnegie had to leverage himself. He stopped diversifying. He started concentrating. He began selling his shares in the safe companies, the oil, the telegraphs, to pour every single dollar into the construction of the steel mill. He famously said later, "Put all your eggs in one basket, and then watch that basket." By the summer of 1873, the basket was heavy. The mill was half built, the costs were spiraling, and Carnegie was extended. He needed the economy to hold on for just another year, just until he could pour the first ingot. But the economy had other plans. The Panic of 1873 wasn't just a recession. It was a depression that would last for 6 years. It was triggered by the same thing that triggers most crashes: greed, railroad speculation. Banks were lending money to build railroads to nowhere, hoping the government would bail them out or that settlers would magically appear. When the Northern Pacific Railroad failed to attract investors, the house of cards collapsed. When Jay Cooke fell, credit vanished instantly. Imagine a world with no credit cards, no digital transfers. Businesses ran on commercial paper, short-term loans that kept the lights on. On September 18th, the banks stopped lending. Carnegie was in a desperate position. His steel plant was a giant hole in the ground consuming cash. He had payroll to meet. He had contractors to pay. If he missed a payment, his creditors would seize the plant. He would lose everything. His partners wanted to stop construction. They said, "Mothball the plant. Wait for the storm to pass." But Carnegie understood something they didn't: momentum. If he stopped now, the machinery would rust. The workers would leave. The dream would die. He had to keep building, but with what money? Carnegie got on a train to New York. He walked into the offices of the few bankers still standing. He went to see Junius Morgan. He went to his old contacts. He didn't beg, he sold. He laid out his books. And this is the key to Carnegie's survival. While other tycoons were hiding their losses, Carnegie had obsessively detailed accounts. He knew the price of every brick, every screw, every hour of labor. He showed the bankers that even in a crash, his steel would be cheaper than iron. He showed them that once the plant was running, it would be a money printing machine. He managed to secure bridge loans. He sold the last of his personal securities. His safety net was gone. He was now all in on steel. But the war for steel wasn't the only battle Carnegie was fighting. While the panic raged outside on the streets, a silent war was being fought inside his own home. To understand Carnegie's drive, why he refused to fail, why he worked himself to the bone, you have to meet Margaret Carnegie, his mother. Margaret wasn't just a mother. She was his business partner, his confidant, and his gatekeeper. She had dragged the family out of poverty in Scotland. She had sewn shoes to feed them when his father failed. She had instilled a terrifying fear of poverty in Andrew. Her motto was death before dishonor, and to her, dishonor meant being poor. During the Panic of 1873, Carnegie was 38 years old. By the standards of the time, he was a confirmed bachelor, but he wasn't alone by choice. He was in love with a woman named Louise Whitfield. But Margaret would not share the throne. She famously told her son, "There is no woman good enough for you." But the truth was, she was terrified that a wife would distract him from the empire. Imagine the psychological pressure. By day, Andrew is a titan, fighting off creditors, managing millions of dollars, screaming at contractors to keep the steel mill rising. At night, he returns home to a mother who demands total devotion. He couldn't show fear to the bankers, and he couldn't show weakness to his mother. If the Edgar Thompson works failed, he wouldn't just lose his money. He would prove his mother's deepest fear right, that they were destined to be poor. He would have to go home and tell the woman who saved his life that he had thrown it all away. That fear, the fear of disappointing Margaret, was a fuel more potent than coal. It turned his anxiety into aggression. He wasn't just building a factory, he was building a fortress to keep the poverty out.
Back in Pittsburgh, the order was given: keep building. While 5,000 businesses failed in the first year of the panic, while iron foundries shut down and blast furnaces went cold, the hammers at the Edgar Thompson Works kept ringing. And then, Carnegie noticed something remarkable, a paradox of the crisis. Because everyone else had stopped building, the price of materials plummeted. Labor was cheap because men were desperate for work. Coal was cheap. Bricks were cheap. Carnegie realized that building during a panic wasn't a burden. It was a bargain. He was building his empire for 50 cents on the dollar, while his competitors were going bankrupt. He wrote to a friend during this time, "The man who has money during a panic is the master of the world." Once the factory was open, Carnegie needed an edge. The panic was still destroying the economy. Prices for rails were dropping every week. His competitors, the old iron men, ran their businesses by rule of thumb. They guessed the quality of the iron ore. Sometimes the mix was good. Sometimes it was brittle. It was a guessing game. Carnegie didn't like guessing, so he did something the other tycoons laughed at. He hired a scientist. He hired a German chemist named Dr. Freak. At the time, putting a laboratory inside a steel mill was considered insane. Critics said science belongs in the university, not the furnace. But Dr. Freak made a discovery that would pay for his salary 1,000,000 times over. There were huge deposits of iron ore near the mines that everyone considered trash. They believed the phosphorus content was too high to make good steel. Because of this trash ore was dirt cheap. Nobody wanted it. Dr. Freak analyzed the ore in his lab. He realized that with a very specific chemical adjustment in the furnace, this trash could make steel just as strong as the expensive stuff. Carnegie quietly bought up the rights to the cheap ore. Suddenly, the math changed. His competitors were paying $6 a ton for raw materials. Carnegie was paying 50 cents a ton. It was a slaughter. Carnegie wasn't just outworking them, he was outsmarting them. He famously said, "We must have a chemist as our guide." While his rivals were wondering why their profit margins were vanishing, Carnegie was using science to turn dirt into gold. He realized before anyone else that in the industrial age, knowledge was capital. This is a critical lesson for the modern founder. In 1873, the tech stack was chemistry. Today, it might be AI or automation. The tool changes, but the principle remains. The founder who understands the technology behind their product will always crush the founder who only understands the sales. Carnegie became a fanatic for efficiency. If a machine could save 10 cents per ton, he would scrap a brand new $50,000 machine to install the better one. His partners screamed at the waste. Carnegie simply pointed to the long-term math. He was playing a different game. In 1875, the Edgar Thompson Works opened. The panic was still raging. The country was in ruins. But Carnegie began producing steel rails. But having the factory wasn't enough. He needed to sell the rails, and railroads were broke. How could they buy his steel? This is where the forge truly hardened Carnegie. He became obsessed with one thing: cost. He didn't care about the profit per rail. He cared about the cost per rail. He installed a department that had never existed in manufacturing before, a cost accounting department. He knew to the fraction of a cent how much oil was used to grease the gears. If a worker used too much coal, Carnegie knew. His competitors were guessing at their prices. Carnegie knew his floor. When the railroads put out contracts for new rails, the competitors would bid $70 a ton, hoping to make a profit. Carnegie would bid $65. The competitors would drop to $60, bleeding money. Carnegie would drop to $55 and still make a profit. He choked them out, one by one. The old iron mills went bankrupt, trying to compete with his prices. And when they failed, Carnegie bought their factories for pennies on the dollar, stripped them for parts, or retrofitted them for steel. The Panic of 1873 didn't kill Andrew Carnegie. It killed his competition. By the time the economy recovered in 1879, Andrew Carnegie wasn't just a participant in the steel industry. He was the whole steel industry. He had entered the Depression as a leveraged speculator. He exited it as the king of steel. The lesson from the forge is simple but brutal. Fair weather founders build when it is easy. They expand when money is cheap. But true empire builders, they wait for the storm. Carnegie taught us that a crisis is a filter. It strips away the weak, the inefficient, and the timid. It leaves only those who have watched the basket. Andrew Carnegie almost lost everything on September 1873, but because he didn't run, because he doubled down when others folded, he forged the steel backbone of the American century. He put all his eggs in one basket, and he watched it with the eyes of a hawk. This is the Founder's Forge. See you in the next crisis.